Hi, today we're going to rebuild the shock. Now this video is going to be broken into two sections. The first one is going to be how to actually take this apart and put it back together. So if you want to see that real quick, you can just jump right into it. And the second part is going to be about the tools you'll need, stuff I had to find on the internet, and stuff you just might not have in your garage. And finally, this is a long video, so if you want to just burn through it real fast to see if this is something you should even do, don't forget, you can always change the speed of this video down in the YouTube settings. Let's get into it. I'm just recording how much grease is on there from the factory, so we know how much to put back. It's pretty ugly. Also, that O-ring is not supposed to look like that. Don't know how the heck that happened. That's the negative air chamber air spacer that I added. You probably won't have those on your bike unless your bike came with the shock and they had it on there already. Don't know if you can see it, but there's quite a bit of grease in there. Only mention that because the manual suggests a small amount of grease, so I don't know if they changed that over the years. So here's all the parts laid out left to right as I took them off. I do that so you know how to put them back. So start left to right with what you take off first, and when you put it back together, start from the right. Don't scratch that. And that was not on terribly tight, so you put it back. No need to overkill. And that's where you wear safety glasses. And hopefully clothes you don't care about. That's foamed up because I cycled the shock a few times off camera just messing around with it. And I heard it making some squishy noises, so that's probably what there was. Air in there. Let's dump that out. So next they thread on the valve puller and push this little cap down, but since it got above the pan, I'm just going to do it now. And there's the retaining clip we got to pull out. So I don't have the thread puller in here because, honestly, I don't think you need to have it in there to push it down, and it's probably easier to get this out without having the valve puller in there. That came out pretty easy. So I first tried to get under it, pull it up, and that didn't work very well. So kind of came out at the side, and it moved around a little bit, but it didn't take much just to get over that lip. It's under pressure. There we go. And there's your bladder. Okay, so how did air get in there in the first place in my damper stanchion? See how loose that is? I'm assuming the newer ones fit tighter, but that's probably why you need to service your damper and replace stuff like this. They just wear out. Okay, so I forgot to loosen this guy. And so I'll do that now. I imagine that was probably why it was hard to pull out. It's probably just under pressure from, tight seal. But if I had broken this, it probably would have just pulled right out. But also is not on there very tight. I mean, it's not loose, but you don't have to crank this crap down. You don't need to clamp this down too tight. You don't want to crush anything. Just don't want it to. You don't want that to start spinning around when I scratch it up. So it did a little bit here, but I just had to test it and retighten until it didn't move anymore. And this is actually on there probably tighter than anything else so far. Okay, you're supposed to pull off the washer first, but I don't know what's going on with this O-ring. It's supposed to be underneath it. Like that. Don't know how that happened. And on step 43, this part here is referenced as the rebound needle. But then I'll talk about it in this step. Also doesn't appear to have an orientation to it. Looks symmetrical. I don't think it matters which side goes in. One thing I'll mention that I forgot to do actually, before you clamp this in your shaft, you should probably wipe off all that fluid, because that just makes a lubricant and just going to spin around there in those vice jaws. So inside here is indeed the white bushing that they say can be hard to get out. So we're going to hit it with some suspension cleaner. There it is. That wasn't too bad. Okay, so way down in that center hole right here is a white washer, and that's part of the rebound assembly, and that's why we're going to line back up when we put it back together. That's a little snug because of the Loctite. Alright, also DVO says you don't need to reset your rebound adjuster, you can just leave it as is. But it's probably a good idea to note where it's at before you pull it all apart. So, the little white washer there is always all through the hole. That spring washer actually comes apart into 3 pieces, and they're just stacked up. So if we're going to put that spring on first, you would replace the white washer next on top, followed by the silver washer, like such. It's really hard to turn because the Loctite. Bringing in the big guns. Seems like that was excessive. Oh, crusty Loctite. Okay, it's fully disassembled. Everything's laid out left to right in the order I took it apart. First row here are all the new parts. Back row are the old parts that are going to go in the trash. That black line is just a divider. Left side is the air can, right side is the damper. Stuff in the middle, stuff I'm going to reuse. These last two O-rings, not quite sure exactly where they go yet. One of them is going to go in this bleed screw. The other one goes in this damper adjustment part. The DVO recommended not getting in there unless you really wanted to. So I'm going to have one leftover screw because I'm not going to do it. There were a couple of O-rings that weren't included. One of them is the reservoir O-ring, which DVO says doesn't really go bad. You can just reuse it. And the other one, the compression loader. The large O-ring is not included in the kit, and he said you don't need to replace it unless it's worn out, which seems to be fine. But we will replace the needle O-ring and the smaller O-ring on that compression loader. This is that O-ring that was wrapped around the washer, and DVO said a lot of times that gets really mangled and destroyed, and sometimes it's not even there. So when they replace it, they usually use a bigger one. But that's what comes in the kit. This white plastic ring goes right here, and to take that off, you have to basically cut it out and then press the new one on. So that's not listed in the manual, so we're going to try it out and see if I don't break it. So it cuts pretty easily, but it's hard to get a feel for how tight it is. I think I just cut all the way through it. It's pretty soft, but you don't want to gouge this edge there, so I'm just going in and using my thumb, my left-hand thumb, to push it across, so I have more of a controlled swipe. And yeah, it's cut. There you go. That wasn't too hard. So the air can was pretty dirty, and you can see all the gunk and some of these parts here that I pulled out. But the damper stayed relatively clean from debris and dirt. So I'm going to clean it, but I'm not going to go too crazy with a suspension cleaner on something like this, because I know there is some internal mechanism in there and an O-ring. It's probably all lubed up, and I don't want to break that down. So I'll just wipe that down, and probably the same thing with this, because there's that switch there. But I'll clean it up as best I can without getting too much cleaner in there. I might be overthinking it, but that's what I'm going to do. Alright, so this is the piston that you need to put this guy on. But before we go there, I'll show you guys this here appears to be what people refer to as the shim stack. You can see those rings there. And when they do a tune on a shock, that apparently is what they are swapping out, different sizes, and basically how those flex determines how quickly the fluid can flow through. So imagine you can probably order those from DVO and play around with it yourself, but it sounds like a lot of work. So to put this guy on, I was told you just slide it on, but we're going to put a little bit of grease on there just to help it get on there. Not a whole lot, apparently. And there we go. Alright, now let's reassemble the piston assembly. And we're going to grease up these threads here, and that is to help the O-ring slide on. And they don't say this in the manual, and hopefully it's obvious, but you want to clean this grease off before you put Loctite on this, because the grease will make the Loctite not very useful. They also said this O-ring, they at the shop, when they replace these, they use a pretty beefy one, and because apparently they get damaged. I want to show you guys this compression adjuster knob. In this position it's closed, and you can see that silver tab in there. It's all the way sealed up, and if you move it to the middle position, the pedal position, you see on the left hand side it's kind of open, so it's a little fluid through, and in this position it's open all the way. It's like a recessed version of that. See, that's up all the way, and that's down a bit. So basically you're controlling the fluid flowing this way, back and forth. I have a feeling this little O-ring is going to be kind of difficult to get down in there. It's about a ½ inch down there, maybe 3/8 of an inch. And I got it. Okay, now we're going to reinstall the damper adjustment knob and center that guy on there. So we want this white bushing here to be seen. So you can see that to be seen through this hole when you look down. They show that in the manual, but the manual is like zoomed in. It's kind of hard to tell what you're looking at, but you're looking down here and you should see that white ring in there. So put it in just like that. It kind of pops in apparently. Had to push it a little bit. Hopefully you guys can see that. Too much. Now I turned that tight enough that I made my damper adjustment assembly rotate. So maybe you don't need to get it that tight. And maybe actually keep your hand on that while you snug it up. Don't forget to clean off those threads. Also, don't forget to clean up the grease from these internal threads here before you add Loctite and reinstall this guy. This filling is like a hard epoxy or something. Oh, it's actually pretty hard to get out. It just kind of crumbles away. There it goes. So you just got to punch through it apparently. And this looks like maybe it's like 1/8 of an inch thick. And I got to clean up the wall so I can get the Allen key in there. Also, I want to say on this valve, air valve, it did tell me you really don't need to replace that O-ring. You don't need to take this thing apart actually. It said it rarely is an issue. But I did it anyways. And again, the O-ring that you replace this with is a little slightly smaller than what came from the factory, at least on this shock. Maybe they changed the size over the years. Also, Loctite acts as a thread locker, but when it's wet, it's a lubricant, so it's easy to over tighten stuff. So just be aware of that. Now, valve cores you don't need to lubricate, and you probably shouldn't, because apparently the oil can break down that seal. But these being HVAC rated valve cores, I guess they're okay to have oil on them. So I guess HVACs, AC units, I guess, have oil that get on them. So now I'm going to reinstall this O-ring in the reservoir thing. Don't know what it's actually called. Put that back in there. We replaced that O-ring for the compression loader. Now this little O-ring I think is going to be a challenge to get on because it's so small. and kind of a tight fit. Might have to use this pick to get it around that lip. Okay, I got the technique here. Get that pick around the O-ring, then you're going to point the end of the pick in the channel and just kind of push it around. There we go, we did it. The pointy part goes in. And then we're going to load that top part up with a bunch of grease. Why, I don't know. Now when you reinstall this loader, I was told be very careful. I guess you could damage stuff. Wasn't too bad. One of the nice things of these 4 flat edges are this flat edge here should be, it works out that it can be flat or parallel with that flat surface there, so you know how tight to get it. Felt a very small click. Not really a click, more like just a... pull up. So if you have a clamp on your syringe when you're bleeding this damper, you want to make sure it's open. Also make sure the compression switch is in the open position. And you just cycle it 4 or 5 times to get all the air out, although I did about 15 just because I want to make sure it's clear. Also, when you're done, you want to make sure that the shock is completely uncompressed and pulled all the way out. When you remove the syringe, you're going to have some fluid flow out, but that's okay. That's just the system decompressing and equalizing. So it's not sitting flush because there is an angled cut going down the side of this bushing, and the bottom is on the top, so it's not going in. So I'm going to have to just pull that back out, turn it around, which might be tricky because it's all wet and slippery. Not very tricky, actually. You can see the angles on those right there. So currently the bottom one looks like this and the top one looks like this. Before, one was like this, the other was like that, and they weren't lining up. There you go. So you can just push it down. It's popping up just because I bent it in that previous step. And that's okay. So here's another view of that angle cut, and I'm going to bend it this way so that it wants to come back that way. All right. It seems to help to put one side in and then just kind of push it around as you go. There you go. Now for the dust seal. Ah, it goes in. Okay, I thought it just rested on top. Actually, push it in. All right, there you go. All right, it's not twisted. And here's the bumper that we took off early on in this whole process. The manual doesn't show the reinstallation of this, so don't forget it. We're going to inflate this reservoir bladder to about 100 psi so that when pushing this shaft down, we're not compressing all the air out of the bladder and potentially causing leaks. There we go. Time to reinstall the air can. The instructions don't say this, but I'm going to grease a little bit of the inside of the air can right here, because they do it on the air sleeve. So why not? Just be careful, don't damage any of the O-rings. I guess tying it by hand as much as you can with greasy gloves, which isn't terribly tight. Now for the air can, grease up your O-rings. Don't forget which channel you want that O-ring in. It's the bottom one from this angle. And then just go around and make sure that the O-rings are seated where they're supposed to go. And if you have a volume spacer, grease it up and reinstall that now. Apply a little bit of grease to the inside of the air sleeve and install it DVO upside down. Otherwise, you will crash. And be very cautious on these O-rings. You want to make sure you don't pinch them. So go down nice and evenly. Don't do that to them. And line up as you see fit, just push it down. And take your retaining O-ring. Doesn't matter if you lube it up because all this is so messy anyways. So if you haven't noticed, that round channel that we saw earlier that you didn't want to put the other O-ring in is for this O-ring. So if you mess it up, you'll figure it out. Now let's reinflate this to the desired pressure. And then air up your air can last. Let's clean it up with a little bit of alcohol, because it will be very greasy and covered in fluid. And don't forget your indicator ring. We're done. Alright guys, welcome to part 2, where we're going to talk about all the boring stuff like tools you'll need, discrepancies in the manual, some clarification on that stuff, and some makeshift tools I had to make. So let's get into it. So the service manual says you need 1 rebuild kit, but you actually need 3. That's the first discrepancy. And so they are this here. You got the Topaz Air damper rebuild kit, part number 1569008. Costs 16 bucks. You'll need a new bladder. This is a bladder for the Jade, but they're interchangeable with the Topaz. This is the old one, part number 142103. They updated the design. I guess it's a little thicker walled bladder, but they told me that they both work. This one's just being phased out. So it's about 5 or 6 bucks. And this is the one that's called out in the manual. This is the Air Can Service Kit. Part number 1569010. This sucker was $38 for a handful of O-rings. This is kind of like, this makes me sad. This is what it costs to do my entire fork. So I'm a little sad that this is so expensive, but I got it on sale for 24 bucks and I should have bought 2 of them. Another thing not called out in the manual are valve cores. And you don't really have to replace them actually. You can just reuse your old ones, but you may as well just swap them out because they aren't that expensive. 10 bucks for 25 of these, and these are the industrial ones for HVAC, which is overkill, but that's okay. You'll also need a valve core removal tool and also a valve puller. What's a valve puller? This is a valve puller. You use these to pull off the valve stems off your car tires. They just screw in and pull them off. And DVO had to make one of these in-house apparently from the pictures of their user guide, and so that's what we're going to do. Was this overkill? Probably. Well, now that I've rebuilt that shock, all that was completely unnecessary, although fun. You'll need an oil pan to catch your oil, obviously. Also a bleed syringe, which is a Rockshox part number 00.4318.007.001. It's the same one they use to bleed the reverb dropper post. Those are like 34 bucks, and I picked up these off of eBay for $15. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested, if they work. Oh yeah, and some picks, although I only used this one. You also need an 11 and an 18 millimeter wrench and a crescent wrench, flathead screwdriver, and a vise. Here's my vise setup. I got it on a little extension here so oil from the shock doesn't drain all over my workbench. Got this sucker at Harbor Freight, and well, Harbor Freight, it's Harbor Freight. You get what you pay for, but I think I got it on sale for like 50 bucks, and so I think it's going to work pretty good for this. This is hollow cast metal, so if you watch read some reviews online, they can break on you actually if you crank them down really hard, or if you mount something in here and go to town with it with like a hammer. But for like light stuff, like if you just want to hold a shock or hold something to weld or grind, I think they work great. Now, if you do go to Harbor Freight and buy one, make sure you get a good one. Just make sure that the jaws are nice and flush. I went through about 4 boxes till I found one. Some of them are a little like that. These jaws are pretty ugly, and I'm not going to put my shock in there like that because it's just going to scratch it up. So I went to Home Depot and I got this metal I was going to mount right there with some magnets, but I just threw some of the stuff away like a week ago, and this piece cost $10. So I don't want to spend that kind of money just for this little setup. So I found some of this poplar wood in my garage I forgot I had. So I took some of this, cut it down the middle, mounted some magnets, and it fits just nice. To hold the 10 millimeter shaft, I got these Park Tool vise jaws, which seemed pretty nice at first, but then I noticed this sharp edge on both pieces that I'm going to have to file down or sand down. I did see on Etsy some 3D printed vise jaws, which were about 25 or 30 bucks, which looked pretty nice. But I went with these because they were on sale and I needed the free shipping. Also, though, I noticed that based on the markings that these are probably the same jaws that DVO uses in their manual. So I also kind of bought them just, for that. So it turns out I was overthinking all this. I was able to just simply use a smooth side of a wrench and just press out those little rough spots. And when they say soft jaws, they really are soft. So no worries. Suspension cleaner. Now the guys over at Dirt Labs in Longmont sold me this stuff by Finish Line called Speed Bicycle Chain Degreaser, which is probably the same thing. You can also use alcohol. Suspension fluid, 2.5 weight. Now suspension fluid is more about viscosity across temperature, not so much about lubrication, so don't use fork oil, not the same thing. Also, DVO says don't use Maxima fluid because they say it makes their seal swell. However, you can use the Maxima Plush, according to DVO, but you got to go with the 3 weight, which is probably the same thing for most people. Slickoleum Grease, but I was a tool and got Shram butter because I didn't know any better. This 1 ounce jar cost me about 16 bucks, and you can get probably 10 times that for the same price if you buy just plain old generic Slickoleum or Slick Honey. It's the same stuff. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this video with a few notes about the service manual. First, I would recommend you read it about 10 times just to get familiar with the whole process. Also, I want to note that I'm using version 2 of the manual. DVO did say that they might rewrite it or make a video on how to do all this stuff, so this video may be a little obsolete in a few weeks. That said, there is some value to seeing somebody like me do it for the first time to see what kind of screw-ups you might encounter, whereas DVO aren't going to show those screw-ups because they don't make them. There are a few things in there that are a little confusing, like steps 9 and 13 show pictures that don't exactly correspond to the steps. They're showing a picture of the dust seal and the main seal when they're really only referring to one or the other. Also, pretty early in the whole process, they rebuild the air can, but then as soon as they start the damper, it's not rebuilt yet. So I think the manual is kind of set up where you can rebuild just the air can, and that's a little confusing with the whole flow of the whole process. There's also a few steps that aren't shown, like the replacement of the main bumper, and then also there's a big white bushing that goes in the piston that you have to cut off that they don't show being done. So it's all in the video there, but just get familiar with what you got to do, what's going on, and really in the end, if you have any spare parts, spare O-rings, then you miss a step. So if you get stuck, just call up DVO. They're pretty nice, pretty handy, and they're pretty helpful on the phone. So I'll leave a few links and notes in the description of this video for part numbers and stuff you might need. So hope that helps. Good luck.